for inviting me and making the connection. Let's see if I can share my screen here. I should have practiced this. You'd think that this would be like a mastered skill at this point, but we have gone back to a lot of in-person meetings, so I haven't been doing this as much.
I just made you a co-host, so it should give you permission.
So I should be able to share, okay.
Yeah. If not, let me know.
Oh.
It was there.
Was it there?
Yeah, there it is.
Can you see it? Okay. It slipped, it went to a different monitor, so it's going to look like I'm not looking at you, and I apologize for that, but that's probably easier than me trying to move it around. There we go. Well, again, thank you so much for having me. I am here to talk a little bit about stress. And so I feel like I just had sent Sheila a message before this saying, you know, I might have to jump off because I'm being paid to go and do something. So I feel like something that we all experience almost every day, right? But I'm going to be talking a little bit more about stress and, you know, kind of how things have been going in the last couple of years and how to think about presenting burnout and promoting resilience. So my hope is, you know, as far as objectives, that we'll be able to talk more about common indicators of stress and the factors that contribute to the development of, you know, traumatic stress or chronic stress, and then talk about some strategies to prevent burnout and promote resilience. So when we think about stress, you'd be surprised, and I ask patients and families this a lot, like if you ask somebody what is stress, the answers are variable. And one of the earliest definitions is a non-specific response of the body to any demand for change. So that's pretty vague, pretty general. But over time, stress has really become synonymous with distress. And so it's typically considered a bad thing. People don't usually say like, oh, I'm so stressed, in a way that's positive. And, you know, we talk about stressors and we consider those to be unpleasant threats in our lives. And another way that stress is talked about is the rate of wear and tear on the body. And so I'm going to talk a little bit too about physical symptoms of stress. But a couple of questions to consider as we're talking, you know, today is the possibility of good stress, or are there good outcomes from stress? And spoiler alert is that there is actually a thing called good stress, which is called eustress. And, you know, really common examples of this are when people are reporting a lot of stress about planning a wedding, for example. And so it's stressful, you know, it's taxing, it's causing them to think and maybe have some cognitive and physical symptoms of stress, but ultimately it's a good thing, and it's a positive thing. One thing though that clinical research and experimental research can agree on though, is that for people who have little or no control, that is always stressful. And so I think when we think about working in a healthcare setting, working with patients in the hospital, or really even thinking about the last couple of years and how things are playing out for a lot of folks in the community, we can see why stress would be increased, because a lot of people were having that feeling. And how people perceive stressors is variable. And so I put this picture up here because, you know, you could have a whole bunch of people in the same roller coaster car, and some of them might be screaming in glee. Some of them might look like the guy in the green shirt, horrified, but they're all having the same experience, really. And so, you know, some of how we respond to stress is how we perceive it, but it's also kind of what we bring to the table as individuals as well. And stress is actually adaptive, and so it can be a really good thing. I call this the Goldilocks zone. And so it's like, you know, with stress, you don't want too much, you don't want too little, you want it to be right there in the Goldilocks zone. And when we're able to function like that, we tend to, as humans, be, you know, happier, more productive, and able to function well in our day to day. The challenge is when you go out of your comfort zone into that, you know, what is listed here as kind of the hump or the fatigue zone, that can start to push folks over the edge to where they get closer to experiencing some of the signs and symptoms of burnout. So the question is, you know, once you find yourself getting closer to that hump, is one, can you recognize it? And two, do you have the skills or control over your situation to bring yourself back to that Goldilocks area? Some of the signs and symptoms of stress are listed here in this chart. And when we think about stress symptoms, we think about physical symptoms of stress. And so there's actually so much that can happen in our body with our autonomic nervous system when we're stressed. And so all those smooth muscles and those parts of your body that are functioning automatically can really get out of whack when you're stressed. And so a lot of people talk about, GI issues, or there's, nausea, heartburn, headache, a lot of somatic complaints related to stress. And that's because stress does impact us physically. Stress can also impact our mood, our emotional functioning, cognitive functioning, and so it can make it difficult to concentrate. People might be more irritable, anxious, restless. You can see some of the other symptoms listed here. And then ultimately how we're feeling physically and emotionally, behaviorally, or physically and emotionally, excuse me, can impact how we behave. And so it can change our behaviors, sometimes leading us to use coping strategies that work well in the moment, but maybe aren't as effective long-term, or develop some unhealthy habits as a result. And so, stress is normal. We all experience it. But when we think about chronic stress, that is when stressors are present in our life and they don't remit, and maybe we're also not coping as well as we can with them, or we don't have the skills or the control over the environment to cope well. And so thinking about chronic stress, when we think about who's at risk for that, it's really anyone who's exposed to at least one potentially traumatic event. And I talk about events as potentially traumatic, just kind of like the folks on the roller coaster. What makes something traumatic for one person may not lead it to be interpreted as traumatic for another. Helping professionals are at higher risk. And so anyone on this call who's compassionate, empathic, and cares about others. And really, ultimately, there's nobody who's immune to stress. We all experience it. So some contributing factors to both, our stress experience and development of chronic stress include coping skills. So I think about this as kind of what we bring to the table, whether we have them, whether we don't, whether they're healthy coping skills or whether they're unhealthy. Family and social supports. And I think in the last couple of years, this is something that even for folks who had family and social supports, they maybe didn't feel as connected to or as able to utilize those supports. And then previous existing psychopathology, so anxiety, depression, previous traumatic experiences, and then, like I mentioned, exposure to potential trauma. So thinking about that figure that I put up, really chronic stress is when we're kind of tipping over that fatigue hump and approaching symptoms of burnout. And with burnout, we all hear that word, and it's used a lot. I feel like it's become a buzzword, especially much more so recently. It's been used a lot. But it's actually a lot of times related to stress in the environment. So it's not just related to how we're feeling, it's kind of related to interacting with the environment around us. But initially, folks start to feel exhausted. So they feel overextended physically and emotionally with whatever their tasks at hand are. And then this is the one for me that's always a little bit of a barometer if I start to feel cynical about something that I'm involved in. Or, you have those thoughts creeping in that are just really negative, that aren't helpful. That's kind of the next step in the process. And then ultimately it leads to feeling ineffective, which is not good for anybody, and feeling like your accomplishments are trivial or you're not able to contribute to something that's important to you. So whether it's when you just feel yourself kind of slipping out of that Goldilocks zone, or if you're actually in kind of that full-blown cycle of burnout, it's important to be able to kind of stop and pause and think about what it is that needs to happen. Like, what is it that you can assert control over in order to break that cycle? And so I like this figure because I think a lot of times we're trying to, worry about the people around us and make sure that everyone else is okay. And really, it's important for us to put our mask on first before we help others. And when I'm training, I talk to all of my trainees too about how self-care is really ethical. It's important for us to be able to take care of ourselves if we're going to be involved, especially, again, thinking of the healthcare setting and a place where we're taking care of other people. But this is also true not just only of work, but also at home. So some brief tips for managing stress, and these are meant to be kind of like very easy things you can do anywhere. I gave a talk recently to our vet students at Ohio State University, and they kind of snickered at some of my recommendations because they were things like, joining a gym and taking a vacation. And they were like, do you know how many hours we work? We're post-call. So they gave me some feedback, and I shifted some of my recommendations. And really my hope is that these are things that people can do anywhere. But I think one big one, especially thinking of the last couple of years in the pandemic, is having realistic expectations. And part of this is really acknowledging what is it that you can control and what is it that you can't control. So much of the day-to-day was out of the hands of like the typical, everyday citizen. And we were left to kind of hear, what new rule was coming, where you couldn't go, if you were or were not going to work the next day. So, really focusing on what you can control and what the realistic expectation is there. And it really comes down to basic needs. So sleeping, rest, relaxing, ensuring that you're eating well, connecting with the people around you, whether that's in real life or in a setting like this. But really kind of, turning away from trying to manage all the things that are in your life and focusing inward on what you can control. Being mindful, again, another buzzword. I think we talk about mindfulness and being present, but it really is, again, just really focusing inward on what you can control. So really just pausing, clearing your mind intentionally, taking a few deep breaths and being aware of your body. And I think a lot of times people, talk about deep breathing and think, how can that possibly be that helpful? But when you think about what's happening inside your body, all those different activated systems, your heart's racing, your muscles are tight, your blood pressure may be changing. There's so many things that are going on inside of you. And really the only thing you can control is your breathing. And so taking a few deep breaths actually has been shown to, using biofeedback, really result in a relaxation response that's meaningful. Clear your head with mini breaks. And so this is, I guess, something that I think a lot of at work, which is like, I need to get up from my desk for 5 minutes in between all of my Zooms and Teams meetings. And I'm going to take a really fast walk to go to, maybe get a coffee or walk down the hall and see somebody, but just like getting up and moving. Staying healthy, again, this can relate to food intake. I think during the pandemic, this is also something that's come up a lot with, research that's looked at alcohol use and other drug use, substance use during the pandemic, and people who even maybe were using those, using alcohol in kind of a not concerning way prior may have increased their risk to the point where it was, they were using in a way that either they weren't comfortable with or that, was not necessarily healthy for them. So just being mindful and cognizant of that. Moving, getting up and moving. And I think especially during all of these Zoom interactions and all the time we're spending sitting, just getting up and changing your environment can have a huge impact on your outlook and your mental health. And then staying connected. And so again, this kind of goes back to what I mentioned in the first bullet, but just making sure that you're intentionally interacting with people around you, the people who ground you, and help you, take perspective and attend to things that aren't necessarily stressful. And as you're thinking about, intentionally how to manage stress, the whole idea is that you would want to promote resilience. And resilience is basically being able to maintain and stay in your position or return to your position after a crisis event. So it's kind of getting over that hump and being able to return to your baseline, whatever that might be. And part of this is recognizing the potential impact of stress when it's coming at you, coping, engaging in your self-care, using your supports, and, like I mentioned too, being able to turn off thoughts about work or being able to shift away from whatever it is that might be stressful to you. And again, I think that for folks who, especially in the last couple of years, have experienced a potentially traumatic event or more than one, or felt like they've been in a potentially traumatic event for a long period of time, being able to engage in behavior that leads to resilience and also can lead to post-traumatic growth. And so post-traumatic growth is kind of like the step beyond resilience, where you actually have a positive life change and you were able to grow and shift and change your perspective after a life crisis or a traumatic event. And so I think when, we look at, it'll be very interesting to look at research in, stress, psychological functioning for folks during and after the pandemic. And I don't even know that we can necessarily say that we would be able to measure this yet, because I think for so many folks, we are still in it, but I think this will be a really important variable, as well as kind of all the negative that's come from this, but also looking at some of the positive outcomes as well. I have some resources here that are embedded, and I'm happy to share the slides, and you may be familiar with some of them, but the healthcare toolbox I think is great, and especially you know, when I've had colleagues at work reach out to me and ask for resources, you know, frontline workers coping during the pandemic, that has a lot of really great resources. General stress management tools in the American Psychological Association. And then there's some interesting work that's already being done, kind of predicting post-traumatic growth and what that's going to look like as a result of the pandemic. So I will stop sharing my slides now. I'm happy to answer questions. It looks like there may be some in the chat. I'll see if I can pull that up.
Where does laughter come into play?
Where does laughter come into play? We should always be laughing, Sheila. No, I think that is an important, you know, important comment. And I think that being able to engage in positive, fun activity. And if you think about what happens when I just mentioned all the things going on inside your body when you get stressed, there are a lot of things that happen when you when you laugh and interact with folks who, you know, help release endorphins and all those positive, you know, feelings that happen inside. But sometimes you almost have to be intentional about it because you don't always feel like laughing, and you don't, sometimes when you're stuck in a negative rut, like you don't seek out that person who might make you laugh, and you may even try to avoid them because you want to, you know, it's hard to break out of that sometimes.
Sarah, thank you so much for this amazing presentation. There's so much knowledge here, and I think this needs to be talked about more. And I'm glad that ABA also embraced this conversation a lot this year. I would love for you to share, like, one, how we integrate this into in terms of burn camps, you know, with the burn survivors that we work with, and then also as burn care professionals, how important it is for us to also be in a healthy place so that when we go to burn camp, we're giving these kids the best time.
Sure. We have done, it's actually been more so, I think, with the caregivers, Sheila, at our burn camp, that we've done some work around this, which is teaching, like, you know, kind of like a little brief mini coping skills blitz. We've also had some just like general, you know, group conversations with our caregivers and parents who are present, kind of talking through like what has worked for you and opportunities for other parents and caregivers to learn from each other. You know, none of the recommendations are rocket science. So they're really things that I think it's just like, you know, if you can just have that information on hand and share it with folks and kind of, you know, remind them of the easy things to do, I think that's probably the biggest bang for the buck, you know. And so I think that yeah, coping skills blitz, I think that also practicing with kids, like there's so many fun ways you can do these things, like, you know, how many animals can you stretch like in 1 minute? Like there's so many different ways to, that's a game in my house with my kids. You know, there are a lot of ways to be creative and teach them how to use these strategies pretty quickly too. From a team member standpoint, you know, I think that it's something like building into, in the past, I know with our Burn Nursing Education Day, we've had some of these topics covered. I know for our burn camp, we meet as a committee, although this last couple years hasn't come to fruition, but this fall we're hoping. But I think it's something too that you can build easily into your meetings, you know, even if it's in a blitz fashion or just kind of like a few minutes each meeting to talk about those skills and be able to bring that to camp.
Speaking of the deep breathing and stuff, we started doing literally 3 or 4 deep breaths in our online peer support group meetings, our adult peer support groups, and people love it. People love it. It's so great. Like we did it a couple months ago and then kind of forgot for a little bit. And then we brought it back again this week. And you could just see people like just get that little bit of peace. So I want to see if we can maybe incorporate that into like, you know, maybe our morning flag ceremony or whatever at camp too, and just kind of get everyone to make loud breaths together.
Yeah, I think incorporating those types of things intentionally, one, I think it destigmatizes it. And so, I think sometimes people, I'm sure not in this group, but I think, families that I interact with, they're kind of like, I don't need to do that. Why would I need to do that? I'm fine, and that usually is an indicator that they probably benefit from doing it. But a lot of times too, it's just really, destigmatized and normalized and everyone's doing it. I mean, kids usually have fun, but families, usually engage for their kids as well.
Yeah, when you were going through this presentation, I mean, clearly our campers have been through something very traumatic, but I was more triggering thoughts of the staff, like how do we get them to be not stressed while they're there at camp?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that we've been seeing in our hospital too, is, people are stressed. Their families are coming to us more stressed. Bedside staff are more stressed. And I think another piece of this too is, and it's more challenging for kids. And I actually didn't mention it in this presentation, but I think some of it too is acceptance. And so, acceptance of where we're at. And really, I guess it goes back to that focusing on like having realistic expectations. Like maybe we are stressed, like there are stressful things going on, and what can we do to manage those symptoms, recognizing that it's something that we're all experiencing. And sometimes I think just calling it out too, collectively as a team can be helpful as well. I don't have a magic wand to de-stress.
Yeah. I think there's this element too of like giving ourselves grace and giving other people grace. Like I was late to a meeting this morning, and I'm never late. I'm a incredibly punctual person. And I was like, I felt totally ashamed and embarrassed that I was late. And one of the people on was just like, you know what? In the after times, we're really having to relearn how to, manage our time and balance our expectations, and it's okay. And I was just like, oh, thank you. Like, so I think sometimes just giving each other and ourselves some grace can go a long way.
Absolutely. And I think too, just checking in with each other and making a point to do that can be really helpful. Like I said, sometimes we get stuck in our negative mode and we kind of just like avoid folks around us, but really intentionally checking in with colleagues. And like, choosing to do that 1 or 2 times a day can be really helpful. And I think it just kind of, pays it forward with others, kind of carrying that on.
Man, Sarah, this is so powerful, because I'm just thinking as you were talking about how like from like the camp setting, like how volunteers show up, and it's like, I even think about how I do this myself, where it's like, I want to do everything for my kid, like I show up for camp in like the strongest and best way, and like nothing's going to go wrong, and nothing's, like in your mental capacity of like really pumping that up. And then the reality is like, everything is always, at least for me. So it's like being honest and real, and like recognizing, and I think from like, from a leadership standpoint of like really giving staff permission to not be okay. Like you don't have to come to camp that way. Like it's okay if you come to camp, like Kristen, like if you're late to the, like just, I think this has really made me think about like how those stress, like just the stress of life, and then how that like, there's maybe a silent communication that like, you can't bring that with you, or we can't address that, or that's not welcome here. And that's so not true, because we tell everybody, our kids, to come as they are, and like nothing gets left behind. So this has given me a lot to think about how to kind of approach that and have some intentional conversation that we may have not had before. That's really important.
Yeah, so I don't know if anybody else experiences this, but years ago, we noticed that our girls, primarily the girls' cabins, and then the more we watched, it was actually the boys' cabins too, but differently, had a midweek meltdown. And we've gotten to the point where we called it the Wednesday meltdown. We all were watching for it. We knew that it was probably going to happen. And we started, my leadership team and I started talking about why this was happening and what was going on. And we realized that the kids come in on Sunday and they're so happy to see everybody, and the new campers are blending in, and there's so much going on. And then Monday happens, and Tuesday happens, and Wednesday happens, and they are just overloaded with, activities and excitement and happiness. And all of a sudden it just all kind of just blows up, brews up, and they hit that point where that you were talking about, Sarah. And rather than just slowly going over the edge, it's like going off the cliff. And so we have done a lot in the last few years since we made this realization to prepare for it, and kind of slow down our pace and add in some more what I want to say, relaxing and relaxation type activities into our days, especially on Wednesday, so that doesn't happen. And I just don't know if anybody else has ever noticed that, but oh man, it's it was crazy there for a few years while we weren't understanding what was going on. So staff, oh, just an FYI, staff and campers, Wednesday. That day. So.
Well, and certainly if you can predict something's coming too, like you have a leg up because you can kind of schedule a prevention versus a
Right.
postvention. And it's always nicer to be proactive than reactive. At least it usually feels that way.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Our crazy Wednesday event last year kind of prevented that meltdown for one reason, because we had a COVID case on Wednesday, which put us into reactive mode.
Yeah.
And so everybody kind of forgot about all that other stuff that was going on, and was completely focused on this. So anyway, different type of meltdown.
Not the distraction you wanted, probably.
No, it was not.
I think the other camp time, like JD was saying, the other camp time to really sort of be prepared for is the last day of Camp Blues. Every year we always have one kiddo that has a big emotional meltdown on the last day of camp. Sometimes multiple kids, and sometimes that emotional meltdown looks like tears. Sometimes it looks like almost being aggressive or being, argumentative with staff. And really it's about being sad that camp is ending and not knowing how to do that. So we try to do something in our morning circle where we talk about, goodbyes and how can we hold on to our camp feelings for longer. And but we also just have to anticipate that there will at least be a couple campers who have a hard time on the last day.
Yeah, JD, I like what you said about recognizing the pace for a camp, and knowing that, going a little bit pell-mell might just be too much. But I'm wondering, so like we've been trying to just add a lot more transition time and like mellow activity time for our camp, looking at our schedule. And I'm a little bit concerned if the counselors are going to think that it's too much focus on them and not enough focus on like activities, and the counselors are having to do too much with the campers. Any insight into that?
So that is a great point, Valerie. So we actually, during our transition years of kind of trying to find that right balance of activities and downtime, connection time between the campers and the campers and staff. We did have a few come back and say, this just isn't for me. I can walk them to an activity and oversee that, but I'm just not making that connection with the kid. And so we've had to do some coaching. And I think you as a leadership, just need to recognize that and, try to catch it early. Like Sarah was saying, prevention rather than having a staff member at the end of the week going, this just isn't for me. And so you set that up during your training, or when your team gets together before camp ever starts. And I think that if you talk about that, this year we're going to have 40% of activities, and or even if you go, cabin activities, all camp activities, and then some just downtime to let the kids interact, and with you and with each other. It sort of sets a stage for what's going to happen. And we actually give all of our cabins, what do we call it? I'm trying to remember what we've called it, but really it's it's a toolbox. So it's a lot of interactive games that they can use with their cabin during that downtime. Some of them are silly, some of them, are kind of educational, but without it being educational, sort of indirect education. And so make sure that your staff has the tools in their toolbox to use that downtime or cabin time or whatever you guys call it. And they're able to facilitate that time easily. Maybe it's not a one-on-one talking to the kids. I've got staff members who are great at that, and some who aren't that great one-on-one, but they can manage the group really well. So recognizing those strengths of your staff is really really a great thing to have in your toolbox as well.
We added a lot of additional transition time to our camp last year. We felt it was a good excuse post-COVID. Because we found or had been hearing for years that campers wanted more cabin time. They wanted more time together. So we kind of used it as an excuse. Okay, you've been wanting this, and let's go ahead and add it in. And our camp, both staff and campers, ate it up. They loved it. Having said that, if there is a cabin or two who aren't needing or wanting that extra time together, we always had drop-in options, i.e. we always had the arts and crafts cabin open, so where they could go as a group to the arts and crafts cabin and do crafts together and talk about things, or leaving like a gym open with balls and activities where they could go together as a group and program something that would they could be the supervisors of said activities, but didn't need additional staff to facilitate the activities.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Sorry, Tim. Let's keep talking. It's a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This is really fun.
Sharing your knowledge with us. Come back again.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Take
thanks
care,
so much,
everybody.
Sarah. Really appreciate it. Great
Bye.
conversation.
Bye.
Bye. Tim, I love what you were sharing because, it's interesting to think about this conversation. When I first started with our program, we had every single second planned.
Yeah, same here.
It was exhausting. I remember as a volunteer, I was so worn out, and we started to realize some of the intention or some of what was happening was so much was going on. The kids had no time to nobody had time to process or experience anything because you were running, sweating. I remember being I'm late to flagpole. I just got my clothes on. What do you mean? So much of that, it's you know better and you do better and you learn. And it's we've still had a few volunteers not maybe understand, but I think the kids when you're a volunteer and you have to get especially the little kids, if you have to get 10 little people to put on their sunscreen, change their swimsuit and remember their name tag and their water bottle and their towel and their goggles that are their favorite and they can't live without them. And they're, it's that stuff that, in theory is great because we've done the same thing that you guys have mentioned. We've just added so much more time to give people, because there's nothing enjoyable about being stressed about getting from one side to the other, because our camp facility, they've opened up a huge part that's a trail you have to walk that's quite far compared to what it was. And so it takes if you have a lot of people, it can take you 15 or 20 minutes to walk over there. And then now you've just missed half your session and you have to turn and come back. Thank you, Linda, for joining us. Have a great day. So yeah, I love, it's never a conversation I've heard other people talk about. It was just something that we did because it was I'm so stressed.
Yeah.
Well, and I also think it's important to remember that downtime in the cabins is not downtime for the counselors in the cabin. They need downtime too. So when do they get to rest and recharge? It's not any time that they're in charge of campers.
Right. We
Yeah,
started, we used to have a game room. So when kids needed, like, they just didn't have the capacity to participate with, like the activity that was going on. We had this room with like foosball and pinball, or not pinball, but ping pong. And again, it just got wild in there. And so I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, we removed all those games, and instead we call it like the quiet room, and we have like blow up kind of like soft chairs and storybooks and just card games and board games, and we just staff it with a couple of volunteers. So if kids are maxed out, you know, they can go in that room, and there's always at least 2 adults, and the counselor can then take a break. At least get like a drink and sit down and have like 10 minutes of just, so that's worked nicely.
We have a similar thing, Kristen. For us, we all like 2 types of situations. One, our wellness team has what they call like the aloha room, where like if kids just need to like de-escalate, calm down, or just have a little time, they have tons of just like little things they can do there. Or if a cabin wants to go into the ohana, I forget what it's called, into this wellness room, that they can like schedule that with the scheduler instead of going to an activity. And then we also have our camp moms, which always has sodas and candies that we don't give to the kids usually, or we do secretly. So it's like a special treat for them that they can get, or if a counselor just needs a little pick me up, because we don't allow soda normally, they can go into and see the camp moms and have that little thing. JD, it was really interesting. We say toolbox. One of the things we're trying to do this year is actually create a little backpack or box where we have like dice, decks of cards, like just fun little things, interactive things that they can take with them everywhere. Yeah.
Yep. So I like what everybody's been saying, and one of the things that we've also learned is, over many, many years, is that different age groups need different things, right? So our strategy was to give each of the cabin groups a place where it was just theirs. So like our oldest cabin has the swamp, and we modeled it after the MASH swamp. So it's actually a big tent that is just for our oldest 2 cabins. And they can go in there, and they can have sodas. That's the only group we allow to have the sugar, and they have their own snacks in there, and they can have their music. And there's always, at least 2 staff members in there when they're in there. And it's just a place for them to have community. Because we learned that particular group really just wants to have time with themselves, the boys and the girls together. And as long as that's managed, and there's not inappropriate things going on there, the music or the games or whatever they're playing in there, then we really support it. Then we found out that the other groups also wanted their space. And so we have one is called the Quagmire. That's for the next group of kids. And then the next youngest ones have the Puddle. And so it's all, they've all got their space where they can go and just hang out. And mostly in the evenings, but after campfire is really when those types of places become filled up. But we also found that the games that they wanted to play were different. They have really gotten into what's the bean bags in the boxes? Cornhole, yeah, cornhole, and horseshoes and things like that are the kids, the oldest 4 cabins really like. And then the youngest ones are really more into but the boys are playing football and soccer and things like that, and the girls are doing some sort of crafts and things like that. It's kind of interesting. There is some overlap in those things, but just make sure that it's that you're giving those kids the stuff that they want, not the stuff you think they want. So,
I have a random question, and I don't know if we have time for this, but it's something that's coming up with our camp, and it's kind of related to this. Someone said like sometimes the counselors just need downtime too, and when do you give them that? I think that was you, Haley. And this is just an old tradition that I'm trying to evaluate and fix. As when we went through our camp audit, someone mentioned to us of a liability, but bedtime is from like 10 o'clock. That's when everyone needs to be in their cabin and asleep, or in bed at least, trying to go to sleep. We all know camping, we can't control them. But we used to do counselor activities where we would create this time where the counselors all got together, had like some late night snacks, some drinks, like soda pop drinks, and like just a fun time where we played games together and debriefed about our day. It was really healthy and good for us all to have that time. But that meant that no one was in the cabin with the kids at that time. We would have counselors outside the cabin though, and they would monitor to make sure that no one's coming in and out of the cabin. And then they would go around and like check the cabins to make sure everyone was asleep every like 15 minutes. Does anyone, and we've gone away from this now, but like, do you guys ever have the campers in the cabin without an adult?
no. So we do the same thing, Daniel. We do have, counselor games and activities from 10 to 12. Our curfew for the adults is 12 o'clock. They've got to be in their bunks and get, at least 6-7 hours of sleep every night. The way that we do it is that every night, one counselor volunteers to stay with the kids. And what we've found is that the age groups of our counselors, we're all aging. And some of our longer time counselors don't mind hanging out rather than going and doing some of the activities afterwards. But we do it by volunteer. And then we have found that, again, by about Wednesday, almost everybody is staying in and, crashing pretty much when the kids do. So.
Thanks, guys. I needed that validation and to go back to validate why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, we also, Daniel, sometimes like if a counselor really needs a break, we'll see if like one of our nursing staff or like a support person, like who's, wants to make his like tagged along with the cabin or is like interested in hanging, like we'll let them, kind of swap that out, even if it's at night, like if they work it out. Especially those senior kids really try to like be slick and try to do stuff like so. But yeah, like sometimes we do that just to try to give people that opportunity to like have a little bit of adult time, because it's hard because the counselors want to hang too.
Yeah, we have volunteers that are on hand to break staff if they need a break, especially if to take a shower or whatever if they need to do. So. But we just, again, we have to sign it and do a pass off and make sure that always we're following the rules.
Yeah, I think it's really important that you give your staff a little bit of time off throughout the week, every day. We try to give everybody an hour. Some of them take it, some of them don't. We also use volunteers during their day, our day volunteers we pair one or two of them up with a cabin and they follow them through those activities. And so the full-time staff can, back out or, slip out of an activity and go get a coffee and just hang and look at their email or whatever they want to do to relax for a little bit. So. Otherwise, I run a really hard camp, it's cracking those whips. I don't.
I'm gonna say, JD, you and I relax differently. I definitely do not look at my email when I want to relax.
Oh no, I didn't say me, but we try to really limit the use of cell phones at our camp. Other than taking pictures and and whatnot. So some of the people just can't stand it. They haven't seen their email for 3 or 4 or 5 hours. I don't have that problem anymore. Retirement is good. So.
Awesome. Thank you guys. Well, it is 4 o'clock Eastern time on the dot. So if you guys don't have anything else, I want to thank you all for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording. So